Broken Bonds. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 2 in the Heart of Stone series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Anemone dusted off her hands. All right, that should do it. 48 hours of electrolytic reduction, and by Monday afternoon, those tools will look as new as the day they were forged in the prison smithy. Beth laughed. Or the day they were discarded, if they're ones that came with the convicts from England. The tools they made were pretty crude, but still a damn sight better than the ones they were supplied with. It's a wonder those convicts built anything at all, let alone half of Perth and Fremantle. Anemone shrugged. Tracing the history of things is your job, or one of the archaeologists'. I'm just a chemist moonlighting as a museum curator. Little more than a glorified dishwasher, really. Aha, sure, Dr. Seaver. Last time I checked, you don't get PhDs for dishwashing. Boat washing, Anemone corrected her. I did my PhD on marine corrosion on boats. Which is where she'd met Morgan and first been dazzled by his smile. Her heart constricted in her chest. She'd never see him smile like that again. How are the kittens going? Anemone blinked, all the way back to the present and Beth's sympathetic smile. Kittens. Yes. They've grown a lot now, big enough to leave their mum. The shelter's sending over some prospective adopters this afternoon, so I should probably get home before they arrive. Beth's eyes turned misty. Oh, I bet you'll miss them if they do get adopted. Aren't you tempted to keep them? Maybe. If no one wants to adopt them. But the shelter have plenty more cats and kittens for me to foster once these find their forever homes, so it's not like I'll be alone. See? I told you fostering kittens would make you smile again, I saw that. My foster babies were the only thing that kept me going when Brad left me. If I hadn't had them to take care of, I wouldn't have gotten out of bed at all that first week. At least yours still have their mum, mine needed 2 owlie feeds. Worse than human babies, or so I'm told. Anemone forced out a smile. Beth might know about Morgan, but she didn't know about the miscarriage, and Anemone had no desire to tell her about it today. I wouldn't know. She pulled off her lab coat and hung it up. Right, I'm off. See you on Monday. Beth waved, already intent on the flaking paint she was painstakingly restoring once more. Anemone waited for a tour group to pass, then crossed the parade ground to the gatehouse. More tourists milled about in the courtyard, but she weaved through them and headed out, with a wave of farewell to the tour guides at the gate. The markets were in full swing, so she cut through William Street instead of braving the crowds on South Terrace before she headed down High Street home. The barriers were still up, blocking the dug-up road to vehicle traffic, though the footpaths were fine. Full of more people than she was used to seeing too, all enjoying the fine weather and the relaxing of restrictions. Maybe this pandemic really would be over soon, like the news reporters kept saying. She sure hoped so. Anemone trudged upstairs to her apartment, heading straight for the bathroom where she kept the kittens. She cracked open the door, but she wasn't fast enough to catch the dark streak that shot through before she could even get a foot through the door. One look told her who the escapee was, Bruce Wayne, mum to the litter of kittens who remained happily playing in the bathroom. Anemone sighed. Bruce was less than a year old and not much bigger than her 3 surviving kittens. She'd been a stray caught in a quarry before she was brought to the shelter, where her kittens had been born. Unlike her kittens, who were happy to be handled and fine around people, little Bruce wanted nothing to do with them. No one would be adopting Bruce anytime soon, so no matter what happened with the kittens today, Bruce would likely be staying for a while longer. But she could tidy the place up a little. The bathroom had never been so clean, and she was just brushing the kittens one last time when her phone rang. Hello, she said, setting it on speakerphone so she could keep brushing little Clark Kent. Hi, it's Hope from the cat shelter. I just wanted to warn you that we had a lot of interest in your kittens, with more than a dozen people wanting to come meet them. Instead of setting up individual times, I figured it would be easier to run it like a home open. So I brought all their adoption papers and a portable FPOS machine. If I send them up one at a time to see the kittens, would that work for you? Anemone swallowed. Hope would think she was silly if she refused, but this would be the first time she'd had visitors in her new apartment since Morgan died. Well, someone had to be first. Best that it was strangers she would never see again, instead of people who knew her, and would give her long, pitying looks if they saw the boxes of Morgan's stuff that she hadn't been able to unpack. Sure. That sounds fine. Do you want to man the back door, the one to the car park? That way I can leave it unlocked, and when I send the first person down, you can send the next one up. There. A plan. It even sounded like she was in control again, instead of, well, someone who wasn't fit to foster cats. Awesome. Well, I'm in the van in the courtyard, so if you want to come down. The afternoon proceeded as smoothly as a well-oiled machine. Before Anemone knew it, little Peter Parker, Dick Grayson and Clark Kent were on their way to their new homes, where they'd hopefully get more original names than the ones the shelter had doled out, and she had the apartment to herself again. Well, herself and Bruce Wayne, the furry fugitive. Anemone sighed. She'd look for the cat later. Now it was time to prepare something for dinner, and after she'd eaten, then she'd scour the house. She wasn't about to go to sleep with a creature loose in her house, causing who knew what kind of mayhem. 2. Dunstan awoke in darkness, straining his ears for the sound of her. He pushed through pitch until he broke through into gloom, slipping through shadows in search of her. She was here somewhere. She had to be. Not in the basement, where shadows swallowed the silence. Not in the foyer, where the day's dying rays lanced through colored glass windows, staining the floor before they faded. He stepped out onto tiles already chilled from winter's bite. One thing was certain, he would guard his heart this time. Once he'd had the heart of a normal man, capable of love and pain in equal measure, but now he had a heart of stone, impervious to any woman's charms. Footsteps echoed from above. Ah, she was upstairs. Dunstan began to ascend. 3. Anemone threw herself down on the couch. She'd searched the place top to bottom twice and she still couldn't find Bruce Wayne. What if she'd somehow managed to sneak outside? She'd be drenched and cold and probably hiding somewhere, and she'd never hear the end of it from the shelter if she lost a cat. Some foster carer she was. The weather evidently agreed with her, hammering the windows with raindrops so hard they might have been hailstones. Anemone prayed the cat wasn't outside. She wouldn't want her worst enemy out in this. A blood-curdling yowl erupted, only just audible above the rain. Bruce? Anemone called, heading for the stairs. Up or down? Another furious yowl had her breathing a sigh of relief. If Bruce was upstairs, she wasn't outside. The noise grew louder with every step she took, until Anemone stepped into the bathroom Bruce had originally escaped from. Bruce had managed to climb into the kitten enclosure, and she was nosing around it, calling for her lost kittens. Anemone dropped to her knees. I know how you feel, little one. I lost my baby too. You've just got to tell yourself they're in a better place now. Bruce flattened her ears and hissed. All right, I'm not sure I believe it either, but you have to keep going. Remember to eat and sleep and do all the normal things you have to in order to stay alive. Here, let me get you some of the special food I bought. She'd been feeding them the cat biscuits the shelter had provided, but she'd spotted the little individual seafood pouches at the supermarket last week, and somehow they'd ended up in her shopping trolley. It's called saucy seafood morsels, Anemone told the cat as she peeled back the lid and poured the contents into a bowl. It looked like something she might eat, and it didn't smell too bad either. I know food is hardly a replacement for your family, but you have to eat. A chill rippled down Anemone's back. Then a second one. She looked up, just in time to see a fat drop of water disconnect from the ceiling and plop into a growing puddle on the floor. No, the roof couldn't be leaking. Not on a Saturday night in the middle of a storm when no one could come to repair it. She'd have to move the cat to somewhere else. Anemone scooped up the little black ball of fur, which cowered in her arms like she actually trusted Anemone to take care of her. Luckily, Anemone's sweater was too thick for those needle-sharp claws to penetrate, though Bruce dug them in deep. Shall we shift you to the laundry for tonight? Anemone asked. It's dry and warm because I have the dryer on, and I can make up a nice bed for you in the laundry basket. She grabbed the bowl of food. You can eat your dinner in there. The drips came faster now, pattering on the floor almost as hard as the rain outside. The cat squirmed out of her arms and leaped for freedom. No, come back. That's when the world came crashing down. 4. He found her in the bathtub. She rose from her crouch, dust haloing her like an angel as she shook her head and looked up at where the ceiling should be. Then she said a few words that proved she was definitely not an angel. He wasn't even sure what all of them meant. He almost laughed. A lady who could outswear a sailor was not someone to be trifled with. He followed her gaze. Fireworks were going off in the rafters, and two cables that looked for all the world like that telegraph thing he'd once seen spat sparks on the wet floor below as more water cascaded down. Then another shower of plaster came down, dropping the end of one of the cables to the floor with it, as the other swung dangerously low. A yowling ball of fur exploded out of the bathtub and landed on the counter beside him. The little black cat then began to rub her head against the wall, as if she knew he was hiding there. No, Bruce, the woman wailed. One of the cables dangled dangerously close to the cat. He didn't think. He seized the nearest cable, swinging it away from the cat. Sparks sputtered against his skin, but he barely felt them. He tied the two together so they hung well away from the floor and turned to face the woman. Oh my God, how did you? Never mind. I'll go shut the power off. She scrambled out of the bath and set off at a run. She returned a moment later, out of breath and shaking the dust from her hair. That has to be the bravest thing I've ever seen. You could have been killed. You can let go of it now. I've turned the electricity off. He nodded. The cables had stopped sparking, which had to be a good thing. Perhaps it was time to ask questions now. What's electricity? 5. She didn't know who he was or where he'd come from, but Anemone wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. He'd saved her life, so that was one big point in his favor. That already made him a superhero in her eyes. She shone her torch at him, trying to get a better picture of her savior than the one she'd seen through the flickering sparks from the torn power cables. Actually, the first thing her torch beam landed on was Bruce, purring all over the man's feet. Bruce, the cat who didn't like anyone. Well, he couldn't be that bad if Bruce liked him. Anemone felt her shoulders relax almost of their own accord. She took a deep breath and looked closer. Bare toes peeped out of the bottom of his baggy pants, the sort her dad had worn when she was a kid, when those were fashionable, and ridges of muscle just rose up from there. There was something behind him, shadowed by his body, like a sort of cape. Exactly what she'd expect a superhero to wear. She wanted to lift the beam to illuminate his face, but blinding him would be rude. So it was much more acceptable to let the light play across his abs, as she wondered what to say to Batman's younger, better-looking brother. That has to be the bravest thing I've ever seen. You could have been killed. You can let go of it now. I've turned the electricity off. Oh God, now she was babbling. She should be saying thank you, asking him who he was or how he'd gotten in here. "What's electricity?" he asked. Anemone blinked. Was he testing her? Or maybe he had taken a jolt from the wiring and now his brain was fried. It's the flow of charge, in this case carried by electrons through copper wiring. Probably from the coal-fired power station down south, or maybe a gas turbine, seeing as it's nighttime now, so the solar panels won't be producing any more power until morning. Babbling again. He was going to regret saving her in a moment. Any minute now. Someone pounded on the door downstairs. "Anemone? It's Katina from next door. Are you all right?" Bruce bolted at the sound of the neighbor's voice. Anemone reached down and grabbed the cat before she could escape again, wrapping an arm firmly around her as she headed downstairs. She struggled to unlock the door with only one hand. "Give me a moment. I'm trying." Finally, she got the door open. Hi." Up close, Katina looked younger than she remembered, like she was still at university. "I heard you scream and I just came to check to see if you were all right," Katina said. She'd screamed? Instinct surely, for she didn't remember doing it. Oh, no wonder Batman had come to her rescue. Morgan used to say that when she screamed, she sounded like a banshee heralding the death of the human race. Katina would definitely have heard it. What had she asked again? Oh, if she was all right. Fine. But she'd nearly died, what with water and electricity trying to mix on her bathroom floor. Now, anyway. Some of the rain got into the roof, and part of the ceiling in my bathroom collapsed. Water and wiring everywhere. It's all right now though. I've turned the power off at the fuse box. I'll call an electrician in the morning. After I've had a chance to clean up the mess. And finish questioning Batman. She still didn't know how he'd gotten into her house. Anemone blinked. Somehow Bruce had squirmed free, but instead of running like she usually did, she was rubbing against the wall. Purring. Like she'd done in the bathroom just before Batman appeared. She didn't remember Batman being able to walk through walls. Unless that was a special talent reserved for his younger brother. She really needed to get back inside and ask him, now. Anemone mumbled an excuse for the cat's strange behavior, and tried to pick her up. Bruce, being Bruce, was having none of it. She dodged Anemone's hands, darted between Katina's legs, then skidded around and raced back inside Anemone's apartment. Better than racing down the stairs and into the foyer, or worse, into Katina's apartment. It was a miracle the cat was still alive. Well, let me know if you need help with anything. I'm just across the hall, Katina said, heading back to her place. Anemone nodded, and hurried to close the door before the cat decided to escape again. Once she'd locked the door, she raced up the stairs to the bathroom. Now I don't mean to sound ungrateful for you saving my life and all, but I have to ask. Anemone began. Only to find that she was talking to herself, for the bathroom was empty. The Batman was gone. Bruce rubbed against her foot, letting out a piteous mew. Now that was a first. Let's get you some dinner in the laundry, like we were planning before all this happened, Anemone said. She collected what she needed and carried it down the hall. The cat came with her. As the little creature noshed on her second sachet of saucy seafood, Anemone watched her. If she hadn't seen both of them in the same room, she'd almost wonder if it were possible for the cat to shift into a man. Bruce Wayne and Batman were hardly a stretch. But no. You're not really a Bruce, are you? After today, I think I'll call you Lucky, Anemone said. Lucky was too busy slurping her fish to disagree. 6. The sea was all around her, waves swishing against the hull. No one and nothing but water, from horizon to horizon. But she had to find him. She had to, or he'd be lost forever. Lost to the sea, and then she'd be lost too. Anemone woke up with a start. That bloody nightmare again. Why she kept having it when she knew better than to go sailing alone, she didn't know. But still she did what the grief counselor had told her, because it was supposed to help. Somehow. She was home in bed, in a sea of cotton sheets that were soft beneath her questing fingers. She took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of the drying lavender in a vase on the dressing table. She switched on the bedside lamp so she could see the room for herself. Only to find Lucky, curled up and purring at the end of her bed. "I thought I locked you in the laundry," she said to the cat. Evidently not. Either that or the cat could open doors. Oh shit, what if she'd opened the door to the mess in the bathroom and tracked plaster dust all over the house? Anemone padded upstairs, where the floor was mercifully free of dusty paw prints. The laundry door was indeed wide open, explaining Lucky's freedom, but Anemone could have sworn she'd closed the door before she went to bed. Maybe Batman had come back to save the cat from Durant's file. Perhaps he'd mistaken her for Catwoman, and she should have renamed her Selina Kyle instead. No. Batman and all the other superheroes were fictional. She must have imagined the man in her bathroom. Yet when she raised her camping lantern to light up the place, the mess was still just as she remembered it, with the knotted electrical cables tied into a net well clear of the floor. She'd seen him tie those knots, even if she hadn't seen him that clearly. Maybe he was an angel Morgan had sent, for it could not have been Morgan himself. She'd have recognized his voice. God, listen to her. First she was having nightmares about being lost at sea when she never sailed out of sight of shore, and now she was debating whether she'd been visited by a superhero or an angel last night. Maybe she'd gone mad. Mad or not, this mess needed cleaning up, and Anemone knew she wouldn't be getting much more sleep, so she may as well make a start on it. Back to the laundry for some gloves, buckets, stuff for sweeping and another couple of camping lanterns, before she set to work. She carted bucket after bucket of debris outside to the bins until they were full, and still it looked like she'd barely touched the pile. Maybe because the biggest section of intact ceiling still sat there, too big to take outside unless she broke it up or had someone else to help her. Where was Batman when you needed him? In a comic book where he belonged. It was Morgan she wished was here now. He'd have waded in to help, working alongside her until everything was done. Maybe this never would have happened if Morgan was still here. He would have noticed the signs of the impending ceiling collapse, and fixed things before they got this bad. But Morgan was gone and he wasn't coming back, so she'd have to deal with this herself. Grimly, she grabbed the edge of the ceiling panel, and flipped it up so she could move it aside. Anemone propped it up against the wall, then turned back to the much smaller pile of debris that had been hiding underneath it. She dropped to her knees with her dustpan and brush, ready to continue, but the first sweep of her brush uncovered something brown and leathery. She prayed it wasn't the dried corpse of some long-dead rat, and carefully brushed the dust away from it. No, not a rat, this leather had stitches. But it was so tiny. With shaking hands she scooped up her find. It was a child's shoe, so small it might have belonged to a baby or a doll. Like her own baby might have worn if she hadn't lost him. Without warning, she was dropped back into a nightmare, but it wasn't a stormy sea that surrounded her this time. Instead, it was a pool of blood that she couldn't seem to stop flowing, and the pain in her midsection was like she'd been stabbed. A desperate cry clawed its way out of her throat, as she surrendered to what she knew was not only a nightmare, but a memory. 7. His heart might be made of stone, but it took a heartless man indeed not to be moved by the kneeling woman, sobbing her own heart out on the dusty bathroom floor, clutching a child's shoe to her chest. Why his own son might have worn just such a shoe. The memory itched at the back of his mind, but try as he might, he could not recall what his son's face looked like. All he knew was that he had lost him. as she must have lost her child, for who but a mother could cry in such agony? He didn't think. He stepped from the wall and dropped to the floor beside her, before he pulled her into his embrace. She stiffened at first, but then he said, "Cry as much as you need to, miss. There is no shame in a mother's grief." She sniffled. "But I don't need to, that's why it's so silly. I just can't seem to stop." And she cried some more while he held her before she finally stilled. "Will you tell me about him?" he asked. "The child you lost?" "But I didn't really know him, or if it was a him at all. I knew I was pregnant, and I was just waiting for the right time to tell my husband, until the night I lost him. Maybe I lifted too many boxes, or maybe I did too much, or maybe there was something wrong with him and he never would have survived the birth. I'll never know, but I went to the bathroom and there was blood everywhere. I don't even remember calling the ambulance, but I must have because Morgan wasn't home. He didn't come home. I woke up in hospital and the police were there to tell me. She dissolved into tears again, sobbing even harder than before. He just held her. It seemed like the right thing to do. When she stilled again, he said softly, "I lost a child once too. I never saw him either. His mother married another man and told him he was his father, and she wouldn't let me see him." He swallowed. He could not remember his son, but he could remember her voice, telling him to leave and not come back. "I can't imagine how much harder it must be for a mother," he finished. She pulled away from him so he could see her face as she shook her head. "No greater than a father's grief. If Morgan had known, if I'd had a chance to tell him, he would have mourned right alongside me. We probably would have tried for another child by now, but..." She wiped her eyes. "What about your son? Where is he now?" He spread his arms wide. "I do not know." He considered how much time had passed since the day he'd discovered he was a father. He did know, though he wished it were not so. "But I believe he died a long time ago." She nodded slowly. "It's not natural for children to die before their parents. Wrong somehow, as though the world had twisted on its axis and could never be the same again." He stared at her. How could this woman read his mind? Was she a witch, or some sort of supernatural creature? She offered him a watery smile. "Did Morgan send you?" He shook his head. He knew no one by that name. She gestured at his wings. "I thought, what with those wings and all, you had to be an angel, and maybe..." He was no angel. That he knew for certain. "I'm not an angel but a gargoyle, miss. The gargoyle protector of this building and those who dwell here." He frowned. If this was true, and he knew it was, then surely he would remember helping her when she'd lost her baby. Yet he had no memory of the night she'd described. No memory of her at all. Her smile turned wistful. "Not an angel and not Batman either." "No, miss, I'm not a Batman. I was a ship's carpenter before." He couldn't recall any of his past, except for the snippets of memory that seemed to rise up like flotsam before sinking again. "Before I became a gargoyle." And are hugs and comforting weeping women normal tasks for a gargoyle? She ducked her head, hiding a smile. "I haven't met a gargoyle before and I'm curious." "Miss..." "No, it was Mrs., wasn't it?" She'd been married. "Mrs.?" "Doctor, actually. Dr. Seaver. I met Morgan when I was doing my PhD and he was so proud when I graduated. But you can call me Anemone if you like. Dr. Seaver is what I make obnoxious men at conferences call me, when they try to correct me on things they know nothing about. You're telling me about gargoyles, which you know far more about than I do, so, Anemone." A soft chirp came from the door, followed by the patter of paws as the little black cat crossed the room to jump onto his outspread wings, resting on the floor behind him. The creature curled into a ball and began purring. "And that's lucky," the woman added. He reached over to stroke the cat. It purred harder. "I'm Dunstan," he said. Dr. Seaver, Anemone, extended her hand, like a man would. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Dunstan the gargoyle." Dunstan knew enough of the world to be certain that shaking her hand in a manly fashion was not something he should do. So he leaned over and pressed his lips to the back of her hand instead. He might not be a gentleman, but he knew how they were supposed to behave. "And honor, Anemone." She folded her legs beneath her and gave him her full attention. "Now tell me all about gargoyles." 8. When the sun rose, Anemone wandered to the ensuite bathroom to wash all the dust off, but her mind was firmly fixed in the other bathroom, with Dunstan, though the gargoyle himself had departed just before dawn, telling her that gargoyles could not endure sunlight, for it turned them to stone. Part of her brain wondered at how easily she'd accepted the existence of gargoyles, let alone the one who could appear and disappear at will inside her bathroom, but she had to admit that there were things in this world that science could not explain yet, and creatures like Dunstan were definitely one of them. And he was fascinating. He'd stood up and done a slow twirl to show her his wings, tail and horns. His tail poked out of a hole in the back of his pants, longer and more sinuous than Lucky's tail and ending in a sort of heart-shaped point. His wings had looked leathery, but they'd felt softer than that, more like a stingray. Or maybe a bat. He told her he was made of living stone, despite looking very much like a man, which he had once been, though he had very little memory of that time. A time before electricity, Anemone guessed. Being stone, he hadn't actually been in much danger from the sparking electrical wiring, but he still bore some scorch marks from the sparks, and he said he had felt them hit him. He did not live on the roof, as a statue or gutter spout, but somewhere dark, beneath the house, from which he could be summoned when he was needed. Not the basement, but it sounded like some sort of other realm. It was unnerving to think of a gateway to somewhere else under her house. What if someone or something worse than Dunstan crawled out of it? If anything did, he would protect her from it, he promised, but he didn't think there had been anyone there when he left. It wasn't so much an entire realm but a pocket in this one, just big enough for him. It sounded awfully like a grave or a tomb to Anemone, but she hadn't dared say it. She knew there had been several cemeteries in Fremantle since the first colonists arrived, but none of them had been beneath her house. There had been that news article a few weeks ago, where some high school kids had dug up one of the graves behind the old asylum, and people had been joking about zombies rising from the dead, but if there had been a zombie loose in Fremantle, someone would have gotten pictures of it by now. He did not eat or drink, and he did not need to sleep either. He could fly and walk through walls, though he couldn't explain how he could do the wall thing. It did explain how he'd shown up so fast when the ceiling fell in, though. He knew nothing about the shoe, or how it had come to be hidden in the ceiling. A shoe that looked like it had been there a long time. What she should really do is speak to someone who'd lived here longer than her, like Katina, the girl across the way. If Anemone remembered rightly, the place had belonged to Katina's grandmother, and it had been in her family for some time, maybe even since it was built. Perhaps the shoe had belonged to Katina's many times great-uncle or something. She took her time dressing, still pondering everything she'd learned in the pre-dawn hours. What she really needed to do was to talk to Katina. 9. Anemone had left a message for the emergency electrician, eaten breakfast, loaded the dishwasher, done every other chore she could think of, and it was barely 9 in the morning. Was it too early to go next door to talk to the neighbor? Only one way to find out, she guessed, so she headed across the landing to knock on Katina's door. Her heart sank when she saw that Katina was still in her pajamas. "I'm sorry to bother you so early," Anemone began, wishing she could sink right through the floor. Katina just shrugged. "I've been up for a while. I was about to make my second cup of coffee." Anemone felt a smidge better. If the girl had had time to make and drink a cup of coffee. Oh, no worries then. Well, actually, maybe. This is going to sound really strange. If she told her the whole story, Katina would probably think she was mad. Batman and gargoyles and lucky. Katina already looked skeptical. Just the non-crazy sounding bits then. Okay, I thought it was really weird, but while I was cleaning up the mess from last night, I found a shoe. A kid's shoe. Anemone paused as Katina's eyes narrowed. Oh, this wasn't going well. She rushed to continue. Look, it reminded me of some of the ones in the museum collection. Really old and solid. It looked like it had been in the roof for a while. Damn it, she was babbling again. Too much coffee probably, and not enough sleep. I'm not saying this very well, am I? I work in conservation. I don't find things, other people find them, and then they bring them to me to make sure they're preserved. Or find out if they can be preserved. Archaeology's more your area, and I remember you saying you knew the family who used to live in my apartment before I bought it. She trailed off, then took a deep breath. Look, you said last night to ask you if I needed help with anything. I don't really need it, it's just, there was a child's shoe hidden in my house. If you'd found it, wouldn't you want to know more? Maybe even find out who its owner was? Okay, now she sounded desperate, and her neighbor knew it. Lonely old widow goes mad with only a cat for company, so she digs up a mystery and gets obsessed with it. Yeah, I'd totally want to solve the shoe mystery if it was me. Give me a minute to grab my camera and some brushes, and I'll be right over. I can't promise I'll be able to find anything more than we know already, but I can at least take a look and do things properly, so we have something to go on if you want to dig a bit deeper. Anemone let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Thank you. She nearly hugged the girl, but she'd probably done enough hugging strangers for one day, actually for the month, so she managed to resist. She headed back to her apartment, considered making another coffee, then decided to brew some calming tea instead. Tea that wasn't done yet when Katina knocked on the door. Anemone ushered her in and guided her up the stairs. I stopped sweeping the moment I found the shoe, so you could see it in situ as much as possible, she said. Now she looked around, she could see all the things she could have cleaned or tidied away before inviting anyone in. She couldn't remember the last time she dusted or vacuumed, and there were cat things all over the place. What would Katina think of her? Katina's eyes widened when she reached the bathroom, but Anemone could understand that. The place looked like a bomb had hit it. Thankfully, she didn't comment on the mess but went straight to work instead, laying her things down and taking pictures of the shoe. Anemone wrung her hands. She knew she shouldn't have disturbed the site, but... I'm sorry, I found it while I was sweeping, so I picked it up. By the time I'd realized, I'd already brushed some of the dust off it, and it was already on its side, so most of the crap inside had fallen out. Babbling again. Katina was too intent on the shoe and the surrounding dust to even glance at Anemone. It's not like it's Tutankhamun's tomb, the sort of treasure the whole world will want to know about. Yet she was treating it every bit like a formal archaeological investigation, with a ruler and everything. Anemone wanted to hug her neighbor. Is there any chance I can have a look up there? Anemone blinked. Katina was pointing at the roof cavity where the ceiling should be. Why on earth would she want to go up there? It was probably full of spiders and who knew what else. But if that's what she wanted. Sure. I'll go get the stepladder. It took her a while to find it because she couldn't remember where she'd put it, but when she finally dug it out from one of the guest room wardrobes, Katina didn't look too impatient. Anemone set it up under the gaping hole and held it steady while Katina climbed up, looking askance at Dunstan's handiwork with the wiring. How did she explain that? Without mentioning Batman or Dunstan. They're turned off at the main switchboard, I promise. If they were live, they'd still be sparking. They're safe. She crossed her fingers that Katina wouldn't ask how she'd tied those knots without climbing up the stepladder. But Katina seemed satisfied by Anemone's explanation, and continued up past the cables into the roof cavity. Anemone waited while she looked around, not saying anything as she clicked away with her camera. Finally Katina said, "Hey Anemone, could you pass up my brushes and that ruler? I think I might have found another one." Another shoe? One shoe was weird enough, but a whole bunch of them. What sort of people put their shoes in the ceiling? Anemone passed up her things, then hurried to hold the ladder again, which was wobbling a bit, with Katina standing on top of it. Without warning, a shower of debris came down and they both swore, then started coughing with all the dust that came with it. Katina climbed down again. For a moment she seemed to be staring at the wall, until Anemone realized Lucky was rubbing against the plaster. She wondered if it smelled like Dunstan. Then she looked down at the new pile of crap that had come down from the ceiling. There was another shoe. If she couldn't already see the original one a meter away on the first dust pile, she would have thought it was the same one. She nudged it with her foot, easing it out of the dirt. "It looks like a pair." Katina had the strangest expression on her face, like she was about to say something, then thought the better of it, and knelt down to brush the new shoe clean. She set them together on a bare patch of floor, and there was no mistaking it now, they were a matching pair. So why? Katina took a few more pictures of the pair, then straightened up. She snapped her brush case closed with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it countless times. "Well, I've got some pictures and I'll do a bit of research with those. What do you want to do with the shoes?" She wanted to give them back to their owner, but whatever child had worn these might have died of old age by now. Anemone shrugged. "I don't know. I guess I'll do what we always do in the museum when something new comes in. Bag them and freeze them to kill any bugs." Who knew what sort of bugs lived in that old roof cavity? Katina nodded. "Sounds like a plan. Well, I'd best go have some breakfast, and I'll let you know what I find. And if you do need any with anything, repairs, whatever, let me know, all right? Just because we live alone, doesn't mean we are alone." She stared at Lucky. "Not with Dunstan in the building too?" "Yes." "Well, thank you. I should probably finish cleaning up in here, so I can have a shower." "Another one?" "Yeah, I'll need one too after that." Anemone ushered Katina out, and closed the door firmly behind her. Then she sank down to the floor with her back to the door. Shoes falling from the ceiling. Gargoyles walking out of the walls. Kind neighbors who wanted to be friends. Anemone had lived such a quiet life since she'd lost Morgan, it was almost too much for her to have going on at once. And yet, it was, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Actually, she should probably try calling the electrician again, in the hope he could come out today to sort the wiring. She did not want to be stuck with camping lanterns for light again. Even with Dunstan here, it was downright creepy with the house so dark. If she went to bed early, the nightmares would only come back, and she'd bet every cent she had that there'd be baby shoes in them now. 10. Dunstan might be confined to the walls after the sun rose, but that didn't mean he stopped watching her. When she undressed in the bathroom, he had to force himself to look away, but not before he glimpsed her reflection in the mirror. God, she was built like a goddess. Curves in all the right places, yet small enough to envelope her in his arms to keep her all to himself and the rest of the world away, for as long as she'd let him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd touched a woman, let alone a naked one, but it took all of his self-control not to slip into that shower behind her and offer to help her wash. He might be made of stone, but some parts of him grew harder than the rest, just like any man would, when presented with such a vision of beauty. Her husband must be mad, not to want to be with her every moment of the day and night. He managed to get himself under control while she went to talk to her neighbor, but then she returned and bent over to examine something on the floor. The roundness of her behind as she bent over, stretching the fabric of her pants, showing the exact shape of the perfection these modern clothes did nothing to conceal. He almost stepped out of the wall, sunlight be damned, to fall to his knees in worship. He would not give her his heart, but other parts of his body had no such scruples. Her young neighbor might have been a witch too, for more than once she'd fixed her gaze on the wall as if she knew he was there. The cat kept rubbing against his leg too, even through the stone wall. A sensible man would have descended into the darkness, and fallen into oblivion, to await Anemone's summons. Dunstan, being a glutton for punishment, chose to stay where he could see her. He could not explain it, but he felt it was the right thing to do. Even if it was 7 kinds of wrong to want another man's wife so desperately. If only he could keep his desires under control. 11. All of the afternoon and most of her paycheck later, Anemone had the lights back on. When you get the ceiling replaced, give me a call and I can install a new ceiling light for you. But you'll need a carpenter to replace the ceiling and probably a stonemason to deal with the storm damage, and repair the walls, or this will only happen again. Don't know where you'll find one of those though. These heritage buildings. The electrician shook his head. Anyway, when you find someone to do the work, give me a call and I'll squeeze you into my schedule. The good news is your insurance company might cover some of the costs of the repairs, so call them on Monday. She thanked him and saw him out. When he'd driven off, she sat at the dining table with her head in her hands. She wouldn't know where to start in finding someone who specialized in repairing heritage buildings. Actually, that wasn't true. The staff at the museum would know. The museum was in one of the earliest convict buildings in Fremantle, so they'd have a list of contractors who knew how to take care of century-old falling-apart structures. And then there was the prison heritage officer, who complained daily about how hard it was to keep the crumbling limestone from falling down around their ears. Tomorrow she'd make a few calls. Something would turn up. Nodding to herself, she moved to the kitchen. She usually spent Sunday evenings preparing meals for the rest of the week, and today would be no exception. Especially now she had all the power back on. This week, she'd planned to put a Hungarian-style goulash in the slow cooker, so she set to work on that one first, as it took a night and a day to cook, and needed stirring occasionally in the first couple of hours. She was almost out of smoked paprika. She jotted it down on the shopping list, then checked for what was next on the menu. Chicken and sweet corn soup. That took a bit of time, but it froze well and she could take some of it for lunch during the week. The chicken was browning in the pan, Lucky was happily slurping up the meat scraps, and Anemone paused to add hoisin sauce to the shopping list. What are you cooking? It smells like Singapore in here. She could only stop and stare. Under the bright kitchen lights, he could have been a statue, Michelangelo's David, only wrought in limestone instead of marble and wearing pants. Every bit of him that she could see was lean, hard muscle, including his wings. Maybe not the tail though. Or the horns. But the horns would give a girl something to hold on to if she straddled him, Anemone thought idly before she caught herself. She hadn't thought about another man like that since, before Morgan died. And Dunstan had saved her life and comforted her when she needed it most. He did not deserve to be objectified in the middle of her kitchen, for goodness sake. Even if he would make a magnificent statue. Without the pants, of course. Anemone shook her head to get the inappropriate images out of it. It's Asian-style chicken and sweet corn soup, or it will be. Right now it's just chicken breast pieces stir-fried in hoisin, soy and oyster sauce with a bit of Shaoxing wine. You can have some when it's ready if you like, though it'll probably be another hour or so because I'm making a big pot to last the week. He shook his head. Not a statue anymore. I'm living stone. I have no need to eat. Yet he had a sense of smell which surely meant he could taste. You could just taste it. Stick your tongue in a spoonful of it, maybe? The smell is sufficient. It reminds me of Singapore, you said. When did you go there? He shrugged, and the ripple went through his shoulders and down his wings. I don't remember. Of course. What do you remember? He shook his head. Nothing good. You must have some good memories, she persisted. If I do, I don't remember them. He bowed his head. Please forgive me, Miss Anemone. Dr. Seaver. I am poor company tonight. If you do not need my protection, I will go. Not back to where you were before. It came out sharper than she'd intended. Anemone wet her lips. I hate to think of you stuck in some place dark, like you described, waiting for a summons. I don't even know how to summon you. I mean, what if? Now who couldn't finish a sentence? Then I will go up to the roof. I will not be far. Before she could respond, he stepped into the wall and was gone. Anemone blinked. Having a gargoyle in her house would take some getting used to. 12. A fine mist of rain was falling when Dunstan reached the roof, but the droplets merely rolled off his wings, so he ignored it. Maybe the chill would be a good thing, in contrast to her warm, welcoming kitchen. He'd known her 2 days. He could not possibly have come to care for her in that time. His heart was stone. Hard and impermeable and indestructible. Not at the mercy of some woman, even if he was her protector. The way she talked of tongues and tasting. He certainly hadn't been thinking about soup. And now, even in the winter rain, the images of what he wanted to do to her would not go away. The way she'd looked at him when he first came into the kitchen, just for a moment, her eyes had seemed to smolder, and he'd remembered she was a married woman, not some virgin maiden. She knew what it was like to bed a man. A very lucky man, who wasn't him. God, he was willing to bet she was amazing at it. Swaying, he spread his wings, and in one powerful downsweep, he was airborne, arrowing into the wind in a desperate attempt to wash the dirty thoughts from his mind. 13. Thankfully, no more of the ceiling came down before Anemone had to head into work on Monday morning. The cafe across the road was open, and they did better coffee than the stuff they had in the office, so she decided she had a few minutes for a detour. And a mocha. Or maybe a cappuccino. Good morning, the girl behind the counter greeted her, with the beaming smile only an early morning barista could pull off. Anemone returned it, all the same. Morning. I'll have a doc. Can you do me a mochaccino, please? Sure. You want a muffin with that? A second woman, closer to Anemone's age, stepped out of the kitchen with a steaming tray of muffins. They smelled divine. Hell yes. Anemone's mouth watered. What kind are they? She hedged. White chocolate and macadamia, raspberry and coconut, and of course the triple choc. The raspberry coconut one's gluten-free too. More of a friend than a muffin, really. It was definitely the raspberry and coconut one she could smell. Raspberry, please. But the others looked so good. And one of the others, for later. Light or dark? Today, she wasn't sure. Whichever one looks best, Anemone said. The younger girl started making her coffee. Have you seen The Mothman? The what? It had to be some new movie or TV series. The Mothman. The girl pointed at the screen behind the counter, where a video of a man in a cape grabbed a woman, then disappeared, before the short video played again. We're offering a month's free coffee for anyone who can get another video of him. That was right outside here, you know. Anemone stepped up to the counter to get a closer look at the video. He looked a bit like Batman or Dunstan at first glance, but whoever he was definitely bulkier than Dunstan. It looks like Batman to me. The woman dropped her tongs with a clatter. He looks nothing like Batman. Batman has cat ears and a cape. This guy has wings, and those things on his head are antennae, completely different. Or horns, Anemone said without thinking. They did look like Dunstan's horns. But it couldn't be him. Now the girl peered up at the video. You know, they could be horns. Wings, horns, do you think he might be a demon instead? She shivered. I think a Mothman sounds a lot safer. The woman blew a raspberry. Demons and angels don't exist. That guy does though, and he's bringing in scores of customers in the evenings, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. She glanced at her watch. Are you okay to manage the place alone while I take Rory to school? The girl grinned. As long as no demons show up, sure. Rory. A little girl who might have been about 5 skipped out of the kitchen, her high ponytail bouncing with every step. Anemone didn't know they made school uniforms that small. Can we go now, Mum? Yes, honey. Are you sure you'll be okay here by yourself, Rochelle? The woman asked. Rochelle rolled her eyes. I'll be fine, Mum. She's my mum, not yours, the little girl snapped, setting her hands on her hips. Sorry, Rory. I'll be fine, Tacy, Rochelle said. Tacy nodded. I'll be back soon. Then I'll make a start on the sandwiches. The little family left, leaving Anemone alone with Rochelle. Have the pandemic restrictions hit you hard? Anemone asked. Rochelle shrugged. Me no, but Tacy, who owns this place, had to cut down her opening hours and let all the casual staff go. I think she's done okay with the government support, but it's great for her that things are opening up again. Of course, getting the word out that we're opening evenings again is a bit slow, hence the Mothman contest. She waved at the screen. It's bringing in a nice crowd, but I don't know how long that will last unless someone gets another picture of him. She lowered her voice. Between you and me, I wouldn't put it past Tacy to hire some guy to dress up in a Batman costume, if the numbers start to drop again. I mean, the free coffee is a nice incentive, but if no one sees him again. She looked up, hope lighting her eyes. You haven't seen him, have you? It wasn't Dunstan. It couldn't be. Slowly, Anemone shook her head. And even if I did see this guy, any blurry, shaky shot I got on my phone camera wouldn't be worth showing anyone. I'm terrible at taking pictures. Good thing I can afford to pay for my coffee habit, because I won't be winning your contest anytime soon. Rochelle set her coffee on the counter and popped a lid on top. Then she picked up the tongs. One raspberry free and what was the other one you wanted? Whichever one looks best, Anemone repeated. Because they all looked so good. Rochelle peered into the muffin cabinet. Oh, I found the perfect one. It looks like a chocolate one, all dark on top, but it's pale underneath. Like Tacy poured the last of each batch of muffin mix into the same case, so it's half and half. Light and dark together, perfect for someone who can't decide. She bagged the muffins and set them on the counter next to Anemone's cup. Tomorrow you can tell me which half you liked better. Tomorrow? Anemone couldn't remember the last time she'd deliberately gone out for food, before today. And yet, she wasn't entirely averse to the idea. Maybe she could stand to spend time with people again. Tomorrow, she agreed before she left for work. 14. Anemone had asked around at work, but no one could tell her a good carpenter to come and help her fix her ceiling. In fact, if she found someone suitable to do repair work on heritage properties, her colleagues would consider hiring them too. Especially if they knew anything about restoring convict-era limestone. So just before she went to get lunch, she called the Maritime Museum. Hi, Conservation Department. Emily? Anemone? Oh my God, I was just going to call you. They need to put in some new moorings off Rottnest Island, and the board absolutely refuses to go ahead with it unless a full impact assessment is done on the shipwrecks and the dive trail, and they're insisting they need you on the assessment team. I tried explaining that you don't work for us anymore, that you're on secondment to Fremantle Prison, but because your name is on the last set of wreck condition reports before the dive trail went in, they won't accept anyone else. Please, will you do it? Anemone wished she could say yes, but I'm really not comfortable on boats anymore, Emily. And shipwrecks. I know, but these are over 100 years old and more coral than hull. And it's not like we'd be actually sailing or anything. It's at Rottnest. We'll be anchored really close into shore, and all you have to do is watch the monitors while the divers do all the work. Please, Anemone. I'm really busy at the prison. They've just got funding for some preservation works, and the archaeology team has found all sorts of caches beneath the floorboards in the cells. Plus they're about to start work on the commissariat, which dates back to the 1850s, and there isn't anyone else. We've looked. Everyone else who's even half as qualified or as experienced as you is either interstate or overseas. Normally, we'd fly someone in if we have to, especially with another department picking up the bill, but we can't even do that with the borders closed. Plus they have to get those moorings in before October or they lose the funding, and works are scheduled to start next month. You're our only hope. Honest. And I swear to you, nothing bad will happen. It'll be the safest ship that ever bobbed about on the calmest seas imaginable, spitting distance from shore, all in daylight hours. The site's too rough to dive in all but the calmest weather, so if there's even the slightest hint of a storm, we won't be going out. Please, Anemone. I will personally cook you dinner every night for a month, if you do this. Anemone had to smile at that. You can't cook. That's not true. I've never burned a lasagna yet. That's because you only cook frozen lasagna, and you put it in the oven for the exact time it says on the packet, and you use a lab timer to make sure you remember to take it out on time. It still counts as cooking. I've met men who couldn't even do that. Anemone sighed. Yes, so had she. Morgan hadn't been much of a cook either, but if it was about building things or fixing things or anything that went on the water, he was wonderful at it. He probably would have given the sealing a go on his own. With all his work on replica boats, he might have known exactly what to do too. But Morgan was gone, which was why she needed to find a carpenter, and why she was now working with the prison museum team instead of the one at the Maritime Museum, and why she was going to hate every minute she was on the boat. If you promise not to cook me dinner for a month, I'll do it, Anemone said. But only if my boss agrees. Believe me, at the consulting rate they're paying, your boss won't turn this down. He'll be able to afford a temp to cover your job and pay you, with money to spare. Right, let me give you a rundown on the schedule and which wrecks we'll be inspecting. The rest of the phone call involved Emily explaining the entire project brief, while Anemone scribbled notes down as fast as she could. The more she heard, the more she knew there was no way she could back out now. No one knew those sites better than she did. She'd dived them almost daily during the previous survey. It had been one of her favorite projects at the Maritime Museum, second only to the Batavia relics at the Houtman Abrolhos. Conserving artifacts at the prison was interesting and all, but underwater archaeology was like entering an entirely different world. So see you at the boat ramp first thing next Monday morning, Emily said, and ended the call. It wasn't until Anemone had set the phone receiver back in its cradle that she realized she'd forgotten to ask Emily about a carpenter. Shit. 15. When Anemone arrived home that night, she was greeted by the welcoming aroma of the goulash, now ready to eat. "If you weren't just a mindless machine, I could totally fall in love with you," she said to her slow cooker. A mew from near her feet drew her attention to Lucky, and the now empty bowl she sat expectantly in front of. Sighing, Anemone took care of Lucky's dinner before dishing up her own. She'd picked up a nice sourdough loaf on the walk between work and home, so she cut a couple of slices to sop up the stew. Then she considered the bottle of wine on the bench, left over from what she'd poured into the goulash. Though she didn't usually drink alone, a glass of it would go well with dinner. She reached up for a wineglass. "Good evening, Dr. Seaver." She set 2 glasses down on the counter. "Good evening, Dunstan. And please call me Anemone." She waved at the glasses. "Would you like some wine? Or some goulash?" "I have plenty." "Gargoyles do not need to eat or drink, Anemone." She blew out a breath. "I know you've told me, but it doesn't feel right to be eating in front of you, or worse, drinking wine in front of you without offering to share it with you. Especially as you've been here all day, with the cooking aromas to tempt you into tasting it. What do you do all day anyway?" "When I am not beneath the house, awaiting your summons, I hide within the walls." "Watching," he said. She lifted her wineglass to her lips and sipped. Oh, that was a lovely red. Probably too good to use in cooking, but it was too late now. She'd definitely drink the rest. "What do you watch?" It couldn't be her, she'd been at work. "Your cat found a bug this afternoon, and it was amusing to watch her hunt and catch it." Well, that hadn't changed in all the time since Dunstan was born, right up until the present cat video craze. "And after that? Or before it?" she prompted. He hesitated, then said, "Many people walk past your home on the pavement outside. They wear different clothing than I am used to, and some of them stare at small screens they hold in their hands instead of where they are going. It is most—" A knock at the door interrupted him. "Hold that thought. I'll be right back," she told him, heading for the front door. 16. Anemone opened the door to find Katina standing there. "What can I do for you?" Katina said, "I thought you might like to know what I've found out about your shoes." "Shoes? Oh, the ones that fell out of the ceiling. That was fast. Come in. We're just finishing up dinner." Anemone threw the door open wide, but Katina shrank away. "I didn't know you had company. I can come back later or another day if you like." She'd said we, hadn't she? For a moment, Anemone considered telling her neighbor about Dunstan, then decided against it. If she hadn't seen the gargoyle with her own eyes, she'd think she was mad to tell such a tale. Instead she said, "Oh no, it's just me and the cat. Come in and see." Just as she'd suspected, Dunstan had disappeared again. Almost like he really was a hallucination. "Oh, what is that?" Katina exclaimed. Anemone scanned the room, but the girl's attention was fixed on the bubbling slow cooker. Anemone breathed a sigh of relief. "A Hungarian-style goulash. It takes about 2 days to cook, so I do a huge batch and freeze it in, or I'd be eating it for every meal for a week. Here, I'll get you some." She served it up and cut some more bread for Katina, setting a place for her at the bench. Katina looked torn. "Oh, I couldn't." "Sure you can. There's heaps. It's the least I can do if you've found the owner of my mystery shoes." Katina avoided her gaze. "Yeah, that might not be as easy as I thought." Briefly, she explained about the horrific practice of foundation sacrifices, burying bodies or personal items in the foundations of buildings to protect them. Anemone only half listened, for her thoughts had immediately wandered to Dunstan, and his grave beneath the house, or whatever it was. It sure sounded like he'd been a foundation sacrifice. But witches here in Fremantle? What next? Anemone sighed. So you think a witch put the shoes there? Katina choked, and it took several minutes of coughing while Anemone fetched her a drink before Katina could answer. I don't know about a witch, she began cautiously, but it looks like the shoes were probably put there as part of some fertility or protection ritual. Whether they actually do anything is anyone's guess, and I suppose it depends on what you believe. Protection and fertility. Two things she could definitely do with more of. Well, not the fertility right now, but maybe one day. So I should put them back then? Katina looked shocked. If you believe in that sort of thing, I guess it can't hurt. If they weren't doing anything, then it shouldn't really matter. Anemone thought about it for a moment. Perhaps they'd been put in the wrong place and were somehow responsible for her miscarriage in that very bathroom, her first night here. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, she said softly. If some badly performed ritual were responsible for her child's death, that it wasn't something she'd done or overdone. From what you've said, it seems they're supposed to be hidden near the hearth, not up in the roof. I might put them back in one of the fireplaces instead, up the chimney. Seeing as they weren't doing any good where they were. And one day, if she should ever be lucky enough to have someone come into her life, who might consider raising a family with her. Anemone shook her head. No. She couldn't think about that now. Is there anything else I should do? You mentioned protective marks? Katina seemed reluctant to say much more. Well, in the other buildings where shoes and things were found, there was always more than one in different places. And marks carved or burned into walls and doorways and hearthstones. As if the people who believed in such things thought the more protection they had, the better, right? Katina evidently didn't believe in the supernatural, or any of this. Well, she was young and maybe she was right. Good thing Dunstan had come to her aid and not Katina's. Her neighbor probably would have dismissed him as a figment of her imagination. Then again, it was hard to argue against the existence of someone who definitely saved her life. Besides, Anemone preferred to keep an open mind. Protective marks, she'd heard something about those at work today. Someone at the prison had believed in them too. So Anemone wasn't the only one, which meant there really might have been witches among the early colonists at Fremantle. I know it was certainly the case at the prison. The main buildings are pretty much pristine, with very little graffiti on the walls except where the prisoners got permission to do artwork, in the last days before it was closed. There's not a single convict mark from construction on the main cell block or the gatehouse. But the walls are a different story. Especially the north wall, which blew over in a storm the year after it was built. That was the wall that needed the most frequent repairs too. Strange? She looked up to find Katina staring at her. A storm blew the limestone wall over? Seriously? Those walls have to be thicker than the walls of this place, and about as high. To think a gust of wind could just tip that over, wow. Just wow. It must have made an almighty bang. You'd have heard it for miles. Kind of like her ceiling crashing down on the floor. Well, they rebuilt it right away, seeing as it was a prison wall, and it's probably stronger now than it ever was now. Of course, nothing lasts forever. It's overdue for repairs, crumbling all over the place. If you ever come across anyone who has experience with Victoria-era limestone walls or century-old Jarrah rafters, can you give me his number? It seems the leak that brought down my ceiling was in the walls, not the roof, so I'd want to hire him first. But they want someone like that at work too. The prison's applied for a grant to cover the costs, but there's no way they'll be able to spend the money if they can't find someone capable of doing the work. Katina and her grandmother had lived here longer than she had. If they'd had any repair work done, surely she'd know someone. Katina hesitated. Well, I do know someone who did some repair work on my walls recently. I'll see if he's available. I wouldn't know where to start looking for a carpenter though. Anemone thanked her and soon found herself alone in the kitchen again. But not for long. 17. If you need the services of a carpenter, I am only too happy to assist. She would never get used to the way he stepped right out of the wall like that. Not only are you the only gargoyle I've ever met, but now you're a gargoyle carpenter? There can't be many of those in the world. I don't know any other gargoyles, carpenters or otherwise, but I assure you I know my trade. I built more ships than I can remember, and your rafters are no different to an upside-down ship. Once I am finished, your ship will be as watertight as any of the king's warships. Anemone had to laugh at that. The queen. We have a queen and she has a consort, though probably not for much longer, seeing as he's over 90. Do you remember who your king was? Dunstan stared at her. I had no king. Only a queen too. Well, I suppose that narrows things down. Only which queen was it? Victoria, Elizabeth, I believe there was an Anne between them too. Then again, you do have a Scottish accent. Perhaps it was Mary Stuart. Which would explain why you don't know much about electricity. She stopped babbling when the crease in his brow grew too pronounced to ignore. Let me guess, you don't remember that either? He raised his hands in surrender. I might not remember the name of my queen, but I do remember how to work wood. Only procure the right materials and I shall repair your roof, better than the day it was first built. Anemone sighed. If it was Morgan, she wouldn't argue. She'd just let him do it, and then call in a professional if he told her he couldn't do it. She didn't know the first thing about fixing ceilings, and Morgan had built a boat too. Well, half of one, seeing as he'd never quite finished it. Never would, now. There'll be no procuring anything this late in the evening. Maybe tomorrow, and I wouldn't have the first idea what the right materials might be, so I'd need your help on the procuring part too. She eyed him. I suppose we could order the materials online and have them delivered. That might work. If you feel that is best. He ducked his head. Morgan would have argued about wanting to examine the wood first, and doing his shopping in person. Dunstan was evidently a different kind of, oh. You don't know what ordering things online means, do you? She asked. He shook his head, horns and all. I do not, but you seem to, and if this is the best thing to do, then it is what we shall do. Her head hurt just thinking about it. She had no idea what she was doing, let alone what was best. Let's deal with that later. I think I've earned a dessert tonight. What do you think, profiteroles? She opened the freezer door and peered inside. And right there, front and center, was the pair of baby shoes, double-bagged, like Snow White in her glass coffin for all to see. For a moment, Anemone forgot to breathe. She had to get the shoes out of here. Somewhere she wouldn't have to look at them. She seized the bag and turned to Dunstan. Change of plan. Katina said these should have been placed under the hearth, or in the chimney somewhere. That way, they bring good luck and fertility or something. With your magical ability to walk through walls, can you find somewhere suitable to put these? Because with all the bad luck I've had this last year, I could really do with some of the good stuff. He edged the shoes out of the bag. I shall find the perfect place for them. Then he and the shoes vanished into the wall. 18. There were 2 fireplaces on this floor and neither had a fire lit in them, but neither seemed like the appropriate place for a fertility charm. If there'd been a hearth in the kitchen, that would be the place, for that's where she spent most of her time. Faint memories tickled the back of his mind. He'd done this before, for someone else. Not the same shoes though, and it had definitely been a cooking hearth, in a dark cottage that had none of the wide windows and bright lights of this place. No, if Anemone wanted a fertility charm to be effective, it must be placed in her bedchamber, for surely that is where her husband would take her to conceive a child. It's where he would take her. He'd lay her down on the bed, those blonde curls spread across the pillow, her eyes laughing as she begged him to make love to her as he kissed every inch of her over and over until he could take no more of her pleading, and he gave her what she wanted. What he wanted too, deep inside her, his wings wrapped around her to angle her just right, so that she cried out his name not once but over and over as he pleasured her from dusk until dawn. If she was not already married to another man. When her husband returned, Dunstan would ask her to dismiss him back to the darkness from whence he came. He could not bear to see or hear them together, to see her face alight with happiness as she beheld another man. A man, not a monster. She wanted her husband to make love to her, and she wanted the monster to put this fertility charm where its magic might give her a child to hold in place of the one she lost. And he, obedient monster that he was, would grant her wish. The tiles in the hearth in her bedchamber were firmly glued together, leaving no space for even this tiny pair of shoes to hide. The chimney, of course, was a different matter. There were all manner of nooks and crannies, all the way up. One even had a rat skeleton in there, sitting on a piece of paper with markings on it that Dunstan didn't recognize. Which runes he imagined. One particular nook was about Anemone's eye level, if she stood in front of the fireplace. He brushed away the dust and soot, then carefully set the shoes there. Perhaps they would bring her the child she wanted. For a moment he dared to imagine a little girl with Anemone's golden curls, running about the house like a tiny whirlwind, a storm that swept all before her, until her mother scooped her up for a kiss and a cuddle, her own face alight with joy. Dunstan hoped he would one day see it, just as he imagined. That these shoes or the spell cast on them or some other magic in the world would bring her the happiness she craved. He emerged from the wall to find her eating ice cream in the kitchen. "It is done," he said. She dropped the ice cream bowl on the bench and threw her arms around him. "You are wonderful. Thank you so much." Dunstan closed his eyes and for just a moment, allowed himself to enjoy the bliss of her soft body against the hard stone that was his own. He ached for her more than he'd ever ached for any woman. If she only said the word, husband or no husband, he would. Anemone backed away, a beaming smile still on her face. "I'd offer you ice cream, but..." "A gargoyle has no need for food or drink," he said woodenly. "Or intimacy or love. He might be made of stone, but that didn't stop him from wanting things he couldn't have. Right. So, how about I turn on my laptop and we can shop for ceiling stuff? Bunnings might be closed, but they have a pretty good website." Though he didn't understand most of that, Dunstan still found himself nodding. Whatever made her happy, he would give to her, without question. It was a good thing she would have no need for his stone heart. 19. Dunstan and online shopping definitely did not agree with each other, so Anemone had closed her laptop and gone to bed, worrying about what would happen if she took the gargoyle into a hardware store. Maybe it would be easier to try and find someone else to do the job. Someone without horns and wings. But work kept her too busy the next day to make any phone calls, and all too soon she found herself headed home, squinting into the dying rays of the sunset, until her heels clicked across the cool green tiles of the foyer, and she could shut the rest of the world out for a moment. "I have a list of the tools and materials I will need," Dunstan greeted her as she dropped her keys in the bowl beside the front door. He held out a sheet of paper covered in neat copperplate. If the sheet hadn't been torn from her shopping list pad on the fridge, it would have fitted in perfectly with some of the early prison records. Perhaps his queen's name had been Victoria, or maybe that's just when he'd learned to write. For all the neatness of his handwriting, the list meant little to her. He'd have to come to Bunnings, whether she liked it or not. If anyone remarked on the wings or the horns, they'd just have to say he was a cosplayer, trying out a new costume before the next convention. She looked him up and down. She hadn't been to a convention in years, but even she would have wanted her picture taken with someone as gorgeous as Dunstan. Except for those pants. You can't wear those. They've been out of fashion for more than 20 years. You'll need shoes too. Morgan might have something that will fit you. She beckoned for Dunstan to follow her into her bedroom. All Morgan's clothes were still exactly where he'd left them, in the cupboards and drawers they'd brought from the previous house. Even though she knew in her heart he wasn't coming back, she still couldn't bring herself to get rid of them. Silly sentimentality, she'd told herself every time she said she was going to give his things away, but each time she'd balked before actually taking anything out. And now her sentimentality didn't seem so silly, if it could help Dunstan fix her ceiling. Shirts and pants are in there, and shoes should be on the racks below them. Socks are in there, and anything else you need should either be in those drawers or that wardrobe, Anemone said, pointing to each in turn. She swallowed. I don't know how you'll get a shirt on over the horns and wings, but the more like a normal human you look, the easier this will be. I understand. Then he hunched over, and Anemone didn't realize what he was doing until suddenly his pants were sliding down the most perfect backside she'd ever seen, and I'll wait outside then, okay? She didn't wait for an answer. Outside the door, she buried her face in her hands. Never in a million years had she thought he'd go commando under those pants. At least he'd had his back to her, or she'd have gotten an eyeful of gargoyle peen. After what felt like forever but was definitely long enough for her burning cheeks to cool, Dunstan cleared his throat. Does this meet with your satisfaction? Anemone took a deep breath and entered her bedroom. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment it could have been Morgan standing there, a ghost returned to life, until he turned to face her. Then her mouth turned dry as a beach in summer, while other parts further south turned decidedly damp. Morgan had never looked that good in a pair of fitted chinos and a button-down shirt. His clothes had always hung off his lanky frame, but Dunstan's muscles filled everything out perfectly. It was like he'd stepped out of a menswear catalogue. The shoes are too big. I grabbed a couple of extra pairs of socks, which helped, he said. She let her gaze drift downward, forcing herself to look at his shoes. They look fine to me. Dunstan grinned. These clothes are very fine, and so are the shoes. Finer than I am used to. I will take care not to damage them. I dare not button the cuffs, but if you permit me, I could roll up the sleeves. He demonstrated, revealing his muscles again. If he kept this up much longer, her knickers were going to catch fire. Or melt. Or something. You are very fine, she muttered, then clapped her hand to her mouth, hoping he hadn't heard. Perhaps he hadn't, for he turned away to scrutinize his reflection instead. That's when it hit her. Your wings. What happened to your wings? She gasped out. He turned, and she realized that wasn't all that was missing. And your horns? You said you would like me to look like a normal human. This is what the men of your time look like, as they hurry along the street outside. You do not wish your shopping partner to look like a monster, and so I am, as you see. He waved a hand at his more ordinary form. You can do that? Shapeshift like that? I can take any form you desire to better protect you, he said. She took a longer look. He still had the same muscles everywhere, but without the horns and the wings and tail he looked lesser somehow. As flat as the magazine this man belonged in. But he would blend in just fine in Bunnings, which was what she wanted right now. Right, shall we go then? She asked. 20. Anemone was silent all the way to the goods store, and likely would have remained silent all night if she had her way, for something evidently troubled her. She would scarcely even look at him. Dunstan suspected he knew what the problem was, and consequences and his own feelings be damned, he needed to be certain. So as they left the warehouse, with her car full of all the things he needed to make the repairs to her house, he asked, "Will you tell me about the man whose clothes I wear?" She stared at him for a long moment, then turned her eyes back to the road. You mean Morgan? My husband? We met at the yacht club when I was doing my PhD, researching corrosion in boats. He taught me to sail and let me experiment on his boat. Well, one of them. He lived aboard an old fishing charter boat when I met him. I think he spent more time on the water than he did on land. Truth is, I think he loved the sea more than he did me or anyone really. I understood. I mean, no one can compete with the whole ocean, and I could love it right alongside him. That's why we picked this apartment. It was close to the yacht club and the ocean, and you could see the water from the windows, or walk down to the boat. It was close to my work too, and he was fascinated by the things the maritime archaeologists discovered. Historic boats, he wanted to build one, you see, a perfect replica that we could sail around the world one day, or to somewhere at least. He started one, but he never did finish it. She sighed. I guess he never will now. She did not speak of their love or passion. Perhaps they had been married long enough to lose the blush of first love. Is he away at sea a lot? Dunstan asked. For long voyages away would explain his absence now. She shook her head. That's just it. He was never out for long, and he always wanted me to come with him, not stay behind. Well, when he wasn't taking day charters or giving someone sailing lessons. So when he didn't come back, I knew something was wrong. I still think it was Janus's boat, which was never properly repaired, and always in need of more paint. The other guys said it was a freak wave that hit them and capsized the boat, but Morgan would never have let that happen. He knew the ocean better than any man alive. He wouldn't have. He recognized the reasoning of a woman in denial. One who believed her man would return and keep whatever promises he'd made to her, when time and tide waited for no man, or woman either. So your husband has left you? For the first time he dared to hope. Anemone frowned. Yes. And no. Morgan never would have left me willingly. We were happy and planning all sorts of things for the future. More than anything, he wanted kids, so he could teach them to sail and love the water the way he did. The way we did, or at least before. She shook her head. Part of me wants to believe he's still out there somewhere, that he's alive and one day he'll come back to me. Maybe that's why I still keep all his things just in case, even though I know he's not coming back. The coroner even declared him dead, lost at sea. He wouldn't do that unless he was sure. But no one ever found the boat, or his body. All the other guys aboard were rescued. Just not him. A widow. His hope soared as his heart plummeted. He'd known too many wives widowed by the sea. Seen the way they stared at the water, as if wishing it would give them back the man they loved. The father of their children. I am so sorry. My deepest condolences for your loss. To lose your husband to the sea is a terrible thing. Anemone sniffled, then wiped her tears away with one hand, then the other, never taking her eyes off the road before them. Even the sky wept along with her. Thank you, I think. You must think I'm so silly, a weeping widow, even though he's been gone almost a year now. And no matter how much I wish he would, he won't be coming back. He won't. Dunstan reached out and laid a hand on her arm. There is nothing foolish about mourning the loved ones we have lost. If I could remember any of my family, I'm sure I would mourn them too. A faint memory, the ache of loss, squeezed his heart for just a moment, then was gone. He had loved and lost, but who he could not say. An eternity passed in silence, or perhaps it was just a moment, but the next thing he knew, Anemone was saying, "Right, we're here. I'll go turn the courtyard lights on, and we can bring everything inside. I'll have to look up standard rates for roof carpentry, so I can pay you fairly for your work. This is your house too, and probably has been for longer than I've been alive, but it's my roof, so I'm paying for the work." She seemed to expect him to argue, but Dunstan had too much on his mind to do any such thing. First, he would fix her ceiling just like he'd promised, and then, maybe he'd have wrapped his head around her being not a happily married woman but a widow. 21. When the sounds of hammering and sawing started, Anemone set down her tea and sidled up to the bathroom to take a peek. It turned into a longer look, then outright staring. Dunstan didn't even notice, he was so intent on his work. Sawdust covered him from head to toe, turning his skin gold, for he'd changed back to his old pants, and both the shirt and shoes were nowhere to be seen. His tail wrapped around the piece of timber he was shaping as his wings fanned the sawdust away from him. He was a vision in polished bronze, or he would be if he stood still. Her mouth was far too dry. The sawdust, that must be it. Except other parts of her were anything but dry, and no amount of sawdust could turn her on. She managed to drag her eyes off him, only to end up crouched in the hallway outside, breathing hard. She was lusting after a monster. An actual, honest-to-God monster. With horns. Anemone buried her face in her hands. What would Morgan think if he knew? What would he say? The tears came, but only a few, and then her eyes were as dry as her mouth. Morgan was gone, and no amount of crying or dragging his memory to her attention would bring him back. If Morgan were here, he'd be fixing the ceiling, and Dunstan wouldn't be doing it instead. So what if she was lusting after Dunstan? He was hot, and that she could acknowledge that without feeling guilty meant that maybe she'd moved to a different stage of mourning. Acceptance maybe, or whatever it was. Wherever Morgan was, if he was anywhere, he'd be proud of her, keeping herself together after he was gone. Anemone forced herself to her feet. She had nothing to be ashamed of. Well, maybe ogling the gargoyle who was being so kind to her. Anemone cleared her throat. When Dunstan turned to her, his eyebrows raised, she said, "Thank you for doing this. We never did discuss payment, but I will of course pay you whatever is the going rate." A grin spread across his face, slow and sexy, and her knickers weren't melting. They were sublimating, going straight from solid to thin air, evaporating in the heat of his gaze. "Oh, there's only one thing I want in payment for this," he said. Her mouth shouldn't be so dry. It shouldn't. "And what is that?" she managed to say. Another grin that would have destroyed her underwear all over again, if it wasn't too late for them already. "I think you know." She swallowed. "I do?" She sounded so breathy, so needy, so help her. If he asked, she'd give it to him. "I want you to trust me to finish your boat." He ducked his head. "If I finish this to your satisfaction, I'd like to see your late husband's boat, so I can show you what I can really do." The boat? He wanted to see the slow pie? Of course. She cleared her throat, hoping her voice would come out normal. Of course. That was better. "When you're done here, I'd love to show you Morgan's pet project. If you know anything about North Sea fishing boats and can finish her, that would be wonderful." And a whole lot more sensible than some of the things she'd been thinking. Of course he was more interested in the boat than her. Men were all the same when it came to their passion projects. "I'll head off to bed then, all right," she said. "Sleep well and sweet dreams." "I'll keep working. Gargoyles don't need sleep." He picked up the saw again and went back to work. 22. Anemone lay in bed, but sleep didn't come. Even though she couldn't hear Dunstan working upstairs, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Couldn't get the image out of her head, with all those golden muscles. She couldn't deny the man. No, the gargoyle was good with his hands. If he could work a woman's body half as well as he worked wood, oh, just the thought of his hands on her. Her hands straight south. Well, why shouldn't she take care of herself? She couldn't remember the last time she'd done this, and it wasn't like Dunstan or anyone else would hear her. She might be a widow, but she was still a flesh-and-blood woman, and she deserved some pleasure in her life. And if she imagined it was his hands on her instead of her own, what was wrong with that? It wasn't like he'd ever know. Though that knowing look in his eyes as he'd said she knew what he wanted from her, she was soaking wet just thinking about it. He'd look at her like that as his hand slid down her tummy, peeling away her knickers before slipping a finger inside her, to confirm just how wet she was. Of course his fingers were thicker than hers and longer too, so she'd need 2 fingers to even approximate the feeling of one of his inside her. She closed her eyes. No, he'd want her to look at him. He'd command her to look at him, and when she obeyed, he'd reward her, placing his thumb firmly on that little bundle of nerves, circling faster and faster. Until she cried out for joy. But Dunstan, with his knowing eyes and skillful hands, would never stop at one orgasm. No, he'd want to pleasure her again and again, and not just with his hands. 23. Dunstan! Her desperate cry reached his ears as clearly as if she'd been beside him. It took him only a moment to slip through the walls to where she was. To where she was splayed across her bed, her hand between her legs, and the expression of utmost rapture on her face. She did not need his help. She was. He'd done his share of pleasuring women in the past, but he'd never seen a woman doing such a thing to herself. And he was certain he'd never seen anything as erotic as Anemone giving pleasure to herself. Dunstan yearned to step out of the wall to join her, to replace her hand with his own, to hear his name on her lips again. Oh, Dunstan! She shuddered as an orgasm gripped her. Wait, what? Had he imagined it, or had she called to him? She was breathing so hard, her breasts were heaving beneath her thin nightgown. He could not move. Like the sight of her had turned him to stone, with no sunlight required. Glorious. Goddess. Angel. Irresistible. Paragon. Please. He couldn't even think in sentences anymore. Just words to describe the perfection before him. She only had to say the word, and he would do anything she asked. Her protector. Her paramour. Anything and everything she wished. Desired. Demanded. Dunstan, oh Dunstan. Her voice ended in a sob as she withdrew her hand, slick with her essence. She lay there for a moment more, taking one huge shuddery breath before she released it, and her whole body relaxed. She rose from the bed, the wanton goddess gone, as she padded to the bathroom to wash her hands. A moment more and she was back in bed, curled up beneath the quilt, her blonde curls strewn across the pillow. And while he ached to join her with an intensity he couldn't shake, in the back of his mind was one chilling thought. Even though she'd cried out his name, she hadn't needed his help for any of it. She didn't need him at all. It was a long time before Dunstan could move again, and even longer before he could drag his gaze away from her sleeping form. An age passed before he could return to the bathroom to finish the task she'd set him, but he knew if he lived for a century, he would never forget the look of sheer bliss on her face as she breathed his name like a prayer to heaven. 24. The next morning, Anemone slept through her alarm, something she never did, and she didn't even have time for breakfast before she had to leave for work. Then, when she arrived, she was greeted by the happy news that Luke's wife Bella had gone into labor 3 weeks early, and he was taking paternity leave from today, so instead of just being an advisor on some of the metal conservation works around the prison, she'd been bumped up to project manager, hiring and supervising the contractors. Then she discovered that the next stage on the commissariat project had started early, and seeing as Luke was the lead on that too, someone had slipped that portfolio in with the others on her desk, and the archaeologists urgently wanted to discuss some of the unusual things they'd found under the hearth in the old kitchen. It was already dark by the time she trudged home, the antique lights in the foyer sending their smoky glow across the tiles to entice her up the stairs to her sanctuary. The one place where no one would demand anything else from her, because she lived alone. Only. She didn't anymore, did she? Lucky greeted her at the door, chirping and twining around her legs as she herded Anemone toward the kitchen and her food bowl. Wrestling with the deceptively named easy-to-open foil pouch of cat food took forever, not to mention spilling some of the sauce on her hands, followed by all the hand-washing she had to do to remove the fishy smell from her fingers. By the time she was done, Anemone just wanted to collapse on the couch with a packet of Tim Tams, and not bother with dinner. Would you like to inspect the bathroom, to see if I have done the work to your satisfaction? She whirled to face him. You've finished already? He ducked his head. I worked through the night, then boarded up the window to keep sunlight out, so that I might continue working through the day too. I swept up the sawdust while I was waiting for you to come home, though you'll have to tell me where to put it. You don't seem to have a midden heap, and as your privy seems to be full of water, I didn't know. Anemone shuddered at the thought of having to call a plumber to deal with a sawdust-blocked toilet. She didn't need anything else to go wrong with her house. I'll take it down to the bins out the back, she said, following him upstairs. The ceiling looked as good as new. Better, maybe, seeing as she couldn't remember what it had looked like before. The bathtub, however, was still full of debris and now sawdust. No long luxurious baths until she dealt with that mess. Anemone sighed. He must have heard. If you show me where to dispose of all this, I'll see to it tonight, after you're asleep. That didn't stop her feeling guilty. It was her bathroom, after all. Surely she should be the one to clean it. If you're sure. He nodded eagerly. Of course. I want you to see how well I work, so you'll trust me with your husband's boat. Ah, of course. She'd forgotten about that. Well, the ceiling looks good, but you should probably see the boat before you agree to do anything with it. It's meant to be a replica of the first European ocean-going vessel, built on Australian shores. The museum received word of some documents found a few years ago detailing the construction of the boat, and when I told Morgan about it, he wanted to know everything. Apparently, one of his ancestors built the original boat, and he'd always been fascinated by the Endeavour and Dufkin replicas. Damn it, she was babbling again. How about we go for a walk to the yacht club, so you can see what state he left it in? I'll pick up some fish and chips for dinner on the way back. He smiled. You wish to walk out with me? She blinked. That was an old-fashioned way of saying dating, wasn't it? Like Elizabeth and Darcy dating. Sure. It's definitely safer than going out at night alone. Do not worry, Anemone. I will protect you. She believed him. 25. Anemone pulled back the blue tarpaulin covering the boat. Well, there it is. She did not appear impressed by the half-finished hull. Perhaps in the dim light she could not see it as clearly as Dunstan could. It was a small ship, easily 20 yards long, not some one-man fishing boat, like he'd expected. How many men traveled aboard the original boat, he asked. Anemone scrunched up her nose, something she did when thinking. I think there were about 100 survivors. Morgan kept saying there was a deck and a cabin and flags, but he couldn't build those until he finished the hull and got it into the water. That's the way his ancestor did it, and he intended to do everything the same way as much as possible. Dunstan nodded. A ship this size could fit that many people with supplies. If her late husband had finished building it and rigged it properly, it wouldn't have looked out of place in any port Dunstan had visited. Here, amid the sleek modern craft that Anemone called yachts, it was a warm slice of reality in a sea of shining metal and glossy white hulls. Of the 100 or so vessels riding gently at anchor in this sheltered cove, only one of them wasn't gleaming white. I could finish this ship for you. Make her seaworthy if you have the plans and the timber to do it. This will take more than a night though. Perhaps weeks of work, as the beams need to be shaped and bent, and all the other things that need to be done to make it watertight. Dunstan took a deep breath. I could even take you out for a sail in it when it's finished." Anemone laughed. "You sound like Morgan, my late husband. More like I'll take you for a sail. I don't believe you have your skipper's ticket, while I do. I need it for work, even if I don't use it much anymore." A woman ship captain. He'd never met one, though he'd heard they existed. Pirates mostly, not respectable ladies like Anemone. And yet, he was not against the idea. "I would be delighted to go sailing with you any night you name," he said. She stared at him for a moment, then said, "You know, I haven't been sailing since before Morgan died. And afterward, I didn't want to. But now, a twilight sail sounds wonderful. Let me check the weather forecast. When there's a clear night." "Even when it's finished, a ship this size will need a crew larger than just the two of us," he began. Anemone laughed. "Oh, I won't believe this ship is seaworthy until I see it actually floating in the water, finished." Dunstan drew himself up. "If you permit me to undertake the work, I will finish it, upon my honor. Even if I have to take it apart and reassemble it, plank by plank, your husband's ship will be as good as any trading vessel that ever plied these waters, or any other. Give me a month, and you shall have your ship." She cocked her head to the side. "I take it back. Now you don't sound like Morgan at all. I think he enjoyed the building of the ship more than the idea of it ever being finished, and sailing. It was about the project and the crafting, walking in the shoes of his ancestors. The journey more than the destination. You are a very different man." "I too take pleasure in my work, or at least work well done. But once you have built a dozen such ships, which I did before I had finished my apprenticeship, let alone achieved mastery of my craft, there is more pleasure in completing a job, and knowing it was done well, for there are plenty more waiting. Now the real triumph is when you're forced to repair a ship in a storm while it's at sea, working feverishly to save all the souls aboard as well as your own, so it doesn't sink. A man who is not swift and sure at such a time would have died on his first voyage, not traveled the world as I have." He knew every word to be true, yet he had no memory of even a single place he'd visited. No matter how hard he tried, his mind was frustratingly blank about his past. She didn't seem to have noticed his distraction, for her own attention was turned to the small screen she held in her hand. A phone, she told him, though he still didn't understand how such a thing worked. "Well, it looks like Friday night will be a good time for a twilight sail. A clear night with enough of a breeze that we might not need the motor much." There was no way he'd have the ship finished on Friday. Nor would he have time to find a crew for her. Dunstan opened his mouth to disappoint her. She must have read his mind. "Not in this tub. We'll take Morgan's and my little yacht. Well, I guess it's just mine now. That one there." She pointed. Dunstan chuckled. Of course it was the one non-white boat, but he wouldn't have called it small. It had a cabin, an aft deck, and a mast that towered high above the varnished timber. In sunlight, the wood would glow with warmth, unlike the blinding white monstrosities on either side of it. If he'd had his pick of any boat in the cove, he would have chosen that one. "I look forward to it," he said, and meant every word. "Me too." She looked surprised. "Now, let's get back to the fishing boat harbor, so I can grab dinner before the fish and chips shop's close. I'd offer to buy you dinner too, but..." "Gargoyles do not need sustenance," he finished for her. "No, or sleep, but they do need something to do when protecting me is too boring a job. I mean, it's not like I'm out risking my life every day, needing saving every other minute." Dunstan thought of the last time she called his name. When she had most definitely not needed him. "I believe you do not need me at all, and if you chose to dismiss me back to the darkness from whence I came, you would be just fine. You are a remarkable woman, Anemone Seaver." She turned to stare at him in the darkness. "If you want to go, I won't keep you. Whatever gargoyle thing makes you my protector, I'm grateful, don't get me wrong. I like having you around, and the ceiling, and now maybe the boat. I'd be happy to keep you around as long as you want. She took a deep breath. Or maybe I just don't like saying goodbye. I mean, the last time I said goodbye to Morgan, he never came home. Tears glittered in her eyes, then on her cheeks. Dunstan folded her into his arms. So soft and yet so strong. Anemone was unlike any other woman he'd ever met. I will never leave you unless you wish me to. Even then, I will only be a call away, awaiting your summons. She laughed. A gargoyle booty call. That sounds wrong on so many levels, though I'm sure that's not what you meant. Dunstan did not understand, but rather than call attention to his ignorance, he chose to remain silent. Right, dinner. Ooh, I wonder if they still have that fish and chip ice cream. Surely no one could make ice cream in such a flavor. Times could not have changed so much. Don't make that face, Dunstan. If you tried it, you'd love it too. It's kind of like maple bacon. Salty and sweet and perfect together, even if it sounds crazy when you first hear about it. I do not need sustenance. Or ice cream. Yeah, but I bet you want it. He wanted more than he dared tell her. But he suspected she already knew. 26. What with Luke away and the prospect of being loaned to the Maritime Museum on Monday, Anemone was caught up in a whirlwind of work that was only beginning to wind down on Friday afternoon. Perfect timing for her to finish up the last of her paperwork and leave on time to go sailing with Dunstan. Of course, that's when the archaeology team trooped in, carrying a whole lot of boxes. Anemone looked around desperately for Beth, only to remember that Beth had left early for a dentist appointment. Sue, their admin officer, only worked school hours so she could pick up her grandkids from school, which meant Anemone was the only one left in the office. Can I help you? She asked, looking doubtfully at the boxes. The woman she assumed was the lead archaeologist, she had more gray in her hair than the others, set her box on Anemone's desk with a decisive thump. Tell Luke everything's here, like he insisted it had to be this week. He said everything needed to be logged and catalogued in the prison's collection, before we could move it off-site. We have 2 PhD students starting on Monday, so they'll be coming to collect it all first thing Monday morning. Which meant someone had to catalogue all their finds before the weekend was over, Anemone finished in her head. And the only someone left was her. But surely they didn't need everything. If there were 2 students, each one would have a different focus for their project. Which items will they need on Monday so I can prioritize those? She asked. The woman's eyebrows flew up. Just the ones in that box, and that one, and the one Katie's carrying. So less than half. She could make a start on them now, and if she worked tomorrow too, maybe she could get the job done in time. Put them down on Luke's desk then, seeing as he's away, and I'll get started. She reached for the first box, which was full of stuff that had been stashed under the floorboards. Inwardly, she sighed. There wouldn't be any sailing for her tonight. If she made it home before midnight, she'd be lucky. Several hours later, Anemone finally gave up and called Beth. Hello? It's Anemone. The archaeology team dumped pretty much all their findings on my desk a little after 4 o'clock this afternoon, and it all needs to be catalogued by Monday, when their new PhD students start. I can't do it all myself. Can you come in tomorrow to help? Don't worry about it. Just leave it. I'll handle it Monday. You know as well as I do that PhD candidates don't start work right away. Lit reviews and things happen first. Go home. Drink. Anemone couldn't help but laugh. How'd the dentist appointment go? It sounds like your face is still numb. Said wisdom tooth has to go. Could have gone to hospital, or he said he could take it now. I said, now, not sure if I'll be as happy when this stuff wears off. Gave me some pills though. The good stuff. Can't catalog stuff or operate heavy machinery on drugs. Prison policy. Anemone wasn't sure if she'd understood half of that, or if that half had made any sense, but she tried to piece it together anyway. So, you want me to stop now and let you do the rest on Monday after you're not on drugs for your wisdom tooth extraction? Yep. And drink. Have a drink for me. I'm on antibiotics. Just in case. Can't drink. Right. Got it. Go home and drink. For me. And for herself too, Anemone thought as she shouldered her bag and switched off the lights. She definitely needed a drink after this night's work. 27. After dinner, obedient to Beth's orders, Anemone carried a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses up to the roof. Dunstan followed her, carrying the apple pie he'd plucked from the oven with his bare hands, despite her protests. I'm sorry, I'm too tired to go sailing. After hauling all those boxes around, I'm not sure I have the strength to hoist the sail, let alone steer the boat. Maybe tomorrow if the weather holds, she said over her shoulder. I'm happy to go sailing whenever suits you. Even tonight. If you are too tired, then I shall do all the work while you lie on deck and let the waves lull you to sleep. I shall carry you home if you do not wake when we dock. She had a sudden vision of him flying across Fremantle, carrying her home in his arms. She'd want a picture of that, if only to remind her that it had actually happened. She must be tired. Any sane thinking person would be worried he'd drop her or fall out of the sky. But she trusted him enough to know he would never drop her. Hell, she trusted him enough to let him into her house. She even trusted him with Morgan's boat construction project. But she did not yet trust him to sail the yacht she and Morgan had bought together. They'd taken their wedding pictures aboard that boat, and she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to relinquish her bond to the sea witch. She trusted him with her life because he'd saved it, and she trusted him with Morgan's boat after what he did with the ceiling, but his sailing skills, she knew nothing about those. And if the sea witch was all she had left of Morgan, no man would take it from her while she still drew breath. And God help the gargoyle who tried. Tomorrow, she said, clinking the bottle and glasses down on the table. The weather will still be good, and we can go as soon as the sun's down to enjoy the twilight as well as the stars. Tonight, let's just sit here for a bit and look at the stars. She leaned over and poured 2 glasses of whiskey. And you're going to join me in a drink, because spirits are mostly inhaled anyway, and a good bottle of Laproig can sear even a gargoyle's nose hairs, I'll bet. Dunstan reached for a glass, then grabbed the bottle instead. I know this name. I've seen it, approaching from the sea. This is from where I grew up, though I never could drink it. I preferred Ardeny steel whiskey. They took water from the same spring, but while Laproig was more medicinal, Ardeny steel was what my mother used to drown our fruitcakes and Christmas puddings in. Even without the pudding or cake, it was dark and sweet, the best thing to drink on a cold winter's night. You remembered something, she breathed. Do you remember when? Or how to spell that, so I can look it up? Maybe if I knew how long you've been a gargoyle, I could help you remember more from your past. Dunstan dutifully spelled out Ardeny steel for her, and she tapped it into her phone. It was next door to the Laproig distillery in the 1820s, but it closed in 1868. That's not possible. Are you really 200 years old? Even as the words left her lips, she knew it had to be possible. A man who didn't know about electricity had to have been from a time that far back. Queen Victoria's time. Dunstan shrugged. I must be. If I wasn't a gargoyle, I'd be dead. So would she, because he wouldn't have been there to save her. She suppressed a shudder, then reached for her whiskey. Then shall we drink to long life? Dunstan sat on the chair opposite her and took a glass. He raised it to his nose and inhaled deeply, almost as if he intended to snort the contents instead of drinking them. Some things do not change, even after 200 years. He raised his glass to touch it to hers. To your good health and a long life. And then he drank, gulping it down as though it was water and not whiskey. Anemone took a careful sip, followed by a second. She didn't have a fireproof stone throat. Nor could she sit out here in the winter air without rugging up. She dragged a blanket out of the box and draped it around herself, then reached for the pie. "Do you want half?" she asked, even though she knew the answer. His eyes were dark shadows, but she knew he was staring at her. "If I didn't know better, I would think you are trying to tempt me." She dug in with the spoon. "Why are gargoyles like Fae but in reverse? One bite of human food and you're stuck in our realm, serving humans forever? Is that how you became a gargoyle?" He stayed silent for a long time. Finally he said, "I do not remember how I became a gargoyle." The first bite seemed to explode in her mouth. She hadn't had an apple pie this good in ages. She'd have to go back to that bakery. So it could have been an apple pie. Eve tempting Adam with the fruit of knowledge, and boom, you're a gargoyle, sworn to protect her. "My name is Dunstan, and I never knew a girl by that name." He shook his head. "But I do not deny I have been wronged by a woman, for is it not written in the good book that a woman released original sin into the world?" Anemone laughed. "Not any good book I've read. If you mean the Bible, a book written by men and twisted by more men throughout the centuries to tell people how to behave, yes, I believe they lay the blame for bad things at Eve's feet. As if one woman, and a fictional one at that, is to blame for all the bad things men have done throughout the ages. I'm pretty sure it wasn't a woman who taught a man how to rape or oppress women." "You sound like one of those women who march in the streets in America, shouting about women's rights and equality." A blush colored Anemone's cheeks, which she hoped Dunstan couldn't see in the darkness. "I might have marched in a protest or two during my university days. The world has changed a lot since you were a boy, but I think more change is necessary. We're not quite there yet. I mean, workers' rights, women's rights, civil rights, don't even get me started on LGBT rights or climate change. I think people just want to live their lives and be happy, to not be made to feel like lesser beings to some dickhead in power, but for everyone to do that, or even the majority of people to do that." She gulped down some of her whiskey. "I wouldn't even know where to start. I'm a chemist and a museum conservationist, good with rust and how to undo the damage. Global politics, it might as well be rocket science or brain surgery, it's so far beyond what I know. And I am a gargoyle carpenter. I know about wood and ships, leaving the leading of the world to those who know far more than I do. I can only raise a sail, not a whole revolution, and I knew men who were in Paris who saw with their own eyes that revolutions do not end well for anyone." He poured himself another glass of whiskey and tossed it back. Anemone finished the last bite of pie, but it did not sit comfortably in her tummy. Too much talk of dark times and politics. Can we not talk about how bad the world was and still is? If anything were open and I wasn't so tired, I'd suggest we go to a pub and listen to a live band, or maybe go dancing. Dunstan leaped up onto the table, narrowly missing her plate. "We could dance here. Put on some music, Anemone, and I will dance with you." Anemone reached for her phone and found the playlist she'd put together for some members' party at the yacht club. It was a mix of songs from the last 50 years, so it wouldn't have anything Dunstan would know, but... "Oh, I know this one. Dance with me, Anemone." To Anemone's horrified fascination, Dunstan began to dance the Macarena. As if he'd done it 100 times before. Complete with the sexiest butt wiggle she'd ever seen. "Fuck me," she breathed. Now where had he learned to do that? 28. The moment the song began, Dunstan's body moved almost of its own accord. Though he had no memory of it, he knew this song and the dance steps to go with it. Perhaps Anemone did not, for she did not accept his invitation to dance with him. Very well. He would dance on his own and show her how it was done. He felt her eyes on him even as he turned and jumped with the beat. She couldn't seem to look away, and the heat of her gaze was enough to melt stone. Well, if she wanted a show, he'd give her a show. Dunstan stripped off his shirt and extended his wings. With one downbeat, he rose into the air above her, catching a beam of moonlight as he began to wave his arms again. When his wings grew tired, he landed on the ledge where someone had placed a small fat gargoyle statue and continued the dance, every movement wider, more pronounced. Until it came time to jump, and he used his wings to lift him into the air higher than he could jump, before dropping down for the next sequence. On the street below, a girl stood in the door to the cafe, holding her little screen up as if to block her view of Dunstan's dancing. Perhaps he was being a bit vulgar. Should I stop? He asked Anemone. Only her opinion truly mattered. Only if you want to, she said. Dunstan considered for a moment. Then can you play that song one more time? Anemone smiled. Sure.